few of the skills that we think comms should be based on. So those are the ones we would be using at DEMSOC. They're based on our values as well, but I'm sure you can probably relate on a majority of them. So listening is the first one and is definitely key. And it's obviously linked to how you're able to adapt your communication style to your audience. And I would say that feedback is equally important, especially when you need to assess what you're doing. And then obviously a mix of confidence, empathy, respect, and would also maybe include inclusion are obviously key as well. But these tend to be maybe forgotten, or they need to be reminded at some point when you write, when you want to share something. So just something to like lay the foundations here on the values and the skills that you may need if you dive into that new world of comms. And yeah, so if you go to the next slide, the thing we wanted to remind you is it's written there in big letters, but comms to citizen, unfortunately for us and for you, does not necessarily equal to meaningful citizen engagement. So we put that here just to remind everyone that it's basically never that easy. And the skills mentioned before are really here to help, as well as hopefully the couple of following slides to kind of equip you with some of the potential skills that you may need. We have our charts after this. So obviously we'll share the slides with you, but we just wanted to introduce this one. So it's a chart that we could be using, us and you maybe, in terms of basically steering the activities that you want to do and whatever you're in charge of. So it's basically engagements and actions linked to the level you need. So I'm going to try and be a bit clearer here, but basically the promise is listed on the right hand side, on the promise. They're here to really guide you for your narratives or any messages you need to send out to anyone, any audience. And they're very helpful to keep in mind. So if you go for level 2, for instance, the consult level, well, it's obviously to obtain feedback or decisions, but the promise here is we will keep you informed, but also listen and acknowledge any concerns or aspirations you may have, but also provide feedback on how public input influenced the decision. So it's just some kind of frame to keep in mind when you want to do anything comms related, being written or verbal, anything. And it's a useful tool for us at DEMSOC as well. So just wanted to share this one. The next one we wanted to discuss and introduce. So it's a long list of common challenges. We've listed some, and I'm sure you're facing sorry, it's a hard one for a non-English native, a variety of them. But basically, when I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm sure you have different ones, but hopefully those are the one you can relate. But we really think disinterest and disengagement is really one, like the key one for you and for us in some ways. And there's also linked to that a lack of trust with authority. So it's all about the perception on what you're doing and how it's received. So it's also the typical scheme you have in comms where basically A is trying to send a message to B, but the message in between can be misunderstood or changed or perceived in a different way. So it's all linked to the basics of this. But in your context, we think, I mean, the perception on dry communications as well is something where you can relate, or the amount of existing info, which is true in so many different fields. So a kind of media saturation, but for instance, for local municipalities or councils, sometimes there's a feeling that citizens have had enough. And so, yeah, that's one of them as well. A huge side of challenges is also linked to the resources, be it on the human resource side or on the money side. which is something to keep in mind as well. And so hopefully the next slides will go into easy, achievable things to do. So what we've done with this one is on the mapping and reviewing, is sharing with you a recent overview of our social media. As you'll see, the metrics here are not very engaging for anyone, even for the person who's actually pulling them together. But one way to do it, and to do it in a nice-ish way, is to kind of classify it from non-performant to performant-ish. So obviously this is very social media focused, but that can be used to assess whichever media you're using, or even like a comms campaign, for instance. And this one, it's really all about comparing and seeing which area you can improve. So for instance, in DEMOTEC case, our YouTube and Instagram accounts are in the dormant area of what we do in comms. So it's definitely something we know that we can, easily improve. And on the other end of the spectrum is kind of our Twitter account, which is very active and quite performance. So we know what we're doing well and what we can improve in the middle and at the other end. So yeah, just a helpful thing to keep in mind, because I'm sure that you have many channels, and it's always good to be able to compare them and to share as well with your teams, or ask for someone within your comms team to do that thing for you, maybe. And we go even over to the next one, which is linked to self-assessments. So it's a bit of a mix with the chart here, but basically, I've put tricky one for comms for many reasons. So first, it's often left behind for lack of time or resources. For instance, the assessment of comms, anything campaign, or like on a whole year of comms, but it's also seen as a tricky aspect for comms, because there are not enough metrics, for instance, on a number of media. However, a range of digital tools will give you metrics that you can easily use. So obviously social media, newsletter channels, for instance, or your website stats and the like. And just wanted to stress out that there are other like non-obvious, non-direct ways to assess what you're doing. So for instance, I'm just going to take a very weird example, but if you're running a campaign for a library in your area, you could think about measuring, for instance, the number of citizens who are actually going to the library after a campaign or during the campaign, or the number of books borrowed, for instance. This is not the best example, but it's just to stress out that there are metrics available that you could put in place that are not necessarily available right now. So it means obviously a bit of work, but yeah, those are available at some point if you create them, basically. And two things I really wanted to stress also is the importance of feedback from pretty much everyone, be it your colleagues, the citizens you're targeting, for instance, or anyone above or below your grades within your structure. And it's very helpful to then adjust, obviously. And the last thing on this aspect is to just never forget to compare yourself. So we've done this at DEMOTEC. This is a chart you're seeing at the bottom of this page. We've basically just had a look at, so this is again very social media, but we've had a look at I hate that word, but I have to say it's our competitors corner. And so we checked basically how they're doing on social media and how we're doing compared to their numbers. So we've blanked their names, but maybe you can guess some of them. That's about it. We're going to move to the comms plan. So I hate the word, but it's very useful. And I've just put a very simple, clear example here. It was just to remind you of the questions to ask yourselves, and basically the 6 main things not to forget, which are clear objectives, the audience, the message, the tools or the channels you're going to be using when you're actually going to share those messages, and a bit of a continuous improvement, which is linked to the assessment we've just discussed, obviously. Couple of points below is to really keep it simple. I mean, when you mention the words communications plan, it's you instantly think about a big Excel chart with so many inputs from a number of people and also different views on everything, and also a tool that's encompassing so many things that sometimes it's getting too big to actually handle. But if you stick to the 6 columns here, it's really some kind of clarity as to where you're going and where you want to go. So yeah, I'm not going to go through the bullet points here, but basically they're just meant to say clear stuff and simple stuff. In terms of objectives, so I had to put them, but it's just a reminder, literally. It's a bit of a dry slide, but maybe for some of you, it'll be a bit useful. We just wanted to go through the SMART scheme, which is, there's a love-hate relationship with this one, but it's always useful to keep in mind that your objectives need to be obviously specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound or time-based. But this is very helpful for comms because they kind of tick all the boxes you need to tick when you think about what you're gonna do and how you're gonna plan it. So yeah, we just put that here. We next have a slide on the objectives as well. And so I'm not sure you can actually see what's in there, but once again, we'll be able to share the slides. It's a very useful tool linked to actually the objectives you're setting. And we're using it as some kind of steering wheel at DEMOTEC. So basically, it's a chart where you're crossing your objective, like a key one, and where you at in terms of your activities. So for instance, if I go at the last column, which is celebrating success. So for instance, if you, I'm going to take an example. I'm going back to the library example. Your library, for instance, the local library in your local area has reached a great number of about 10,000 visitors in a month. So you're aiming at really celebrating the success of that library. And what you want to do is kind of see what kind of comms you want to instill in the minds of your citizens. And basically, you just cross one of the lines with the celebrating success, and it's steering you towards where you want to go, where you could go in terms of messaging and narratives. So a useful one maybe to keep in mind if you want to a bit of support in your thinking, and it's so helpful. And the last one I wanted to introduce, it's a very American approach, but it's worth thinking about it. Basically, just wanted to stress that comms can't solve everyone's problems. And I'm saying that because there are probably as many perceptions on comms as there are human beings on the planet. And since you can't achieve everything right now with, for instance, time, human or money constraints, it's just a way to think about what kind of quick wins or what is called fill-ins in a chart you can do. And those are kind of like the mini achievements that are good for you if you do comms, but also that are good for people who can actually relate to what's happening in terms of comms. And all the major projects, or what's written here, I think less tasks, are good to bear in mind. They're kind of steering your comms objectives, but they're also like medium long-term goals. So it's all about seeing what you can achieve in a minimum amount of time, which is also very helpful. That's about it for me. And I will hand over to either Annie or any one of you if you have any questions on what we just shared.
I can keep going and then we can take questions at the end if you're still but yeah, think about questions that you might have or things that you're stuck with, and we can have a chat at the end of this. Yeah, so these are just really my top 5 tips or recommendations that we've sort of been using throughout DEMSOC and our work with PB especially, so participatory budgeting, and we've shared these with in Scotland the communities and local authorities that we've worked with before. So hopefully it's helpful. But obviously, like Paul said, you might create a communications plan, and then you might want to delve a little bit deeper into who the audience are, so who you're trying to reach, especially if it's a specific project or citizen engagement or participatory strategy that you're trying to achieve. So I've put in a picture of skydivers. So if you imagine a group of skydivers as an example, how do they find out about things in their area? Do they go online? Where do they go? Where do they go for fun? So if you think about how you're trying to reach people with the bit of content that you want, and thinking about where they go, how you might find them and engage them can be quite a useful thing at looking at your different audiences and things. So latching on to specific opportunities to grab the interest of the group or the audience that you're trying to reach. So things like events, public places, community centres, schools. Obviously, it depends on the audience, but it can be quite helpful just to think that through a little bit. So looking at age, gender, location, stage of life, maybe their political interests, or if they're distrust. So why is that? Looking into that a little bit deeper can help. So yeah, things like personality traits, their emotions, their passions, their frustrations. So what value or benefit can you bring to them as an audience? So thinking about that, and it can be quite helpful to just write down. So you've got your target audiences and writing down, sort of looking into where they are and why is that, and who's your ideal participant. So when you're writing up your target audience for your engagement strategy or your project, who do you want to bring to the table? Who do you want to bring along? And thinking about, the groups or associations that they might be at, that they might join. What do they dislike? So you're really thinking about the prototype of the audience that you want to bring to your group. So this is, we all have lower attention span these days. So this is a fish. Fish, I think, actually only have 3-second attention spans, something like that. But the 5-second rule, people do have sort of lower attention span. And I'm going to come on to the upside down pyramid in a little bit, which is about content and how you sort of hit people with the right amount of content rather than big chunks of paragraphs, and how you would write slightly differently than you would for a high or a low interest audience. So just thinking about how can you engage people in a better way. You could do maybe a poster series on something a little bit more specific. So I'm talking about participatory budgeting here, but participatory budgeting doesn't mean that much to many people. So how can you make it as engaging as possible, catching people's attention by making it relevant to them and turning it into a bit more of a story to engage them into it. So things like making it personable and relating the story or what you're trying to put out, your messaging to people's everyday lives can be really helpful just to catch their attention in the first instance. Am I missing some slides here? Oh yeah, so the upside down pyramid. So I'll just maybe explain this a little bit. So you've got the bit of information that matters most. So you want to share that. That's the 5 seconds that you want to catch people with. Audience consumption. So this is quite interesting maybe to think about, is most people, they might watch TV, they might they go on social media, they might get random exposure to news, but as it goes down, less and less people tend to do these things. So you can see on the sort of upside down triangle there, the minimum amount of people probably actively campaign. So it's just a good thing to think about when you're putting messaging out and you're trying to reach different groups of people. And same again, so comprehension, using easy read and explanation, short and sweet visual. So using photos of people can really catch attention, or videos. Keeping it really relatable to the people that you're trying to talk with, using things like diagrams or infographics. But then as it goes down, less and less people are less likely to read a news piece or an article or listen to a podcast. And then at the very bottom is academic material. So that's quite a specific audience that might sit and read an academic article. So yeah, most people have low attention spans. So if you just consider that when you're writing your messages, and very few people have high attention spans, so they're less likely to read a long article or academic piece. This is really important. Obviously, a lot of projects, you end up with really tight timeframes. I don't know, you might have 3 months to do it in, but really, really consider right at the start of your project, especially when you're recruiting people, you need to allow time for people to be engaged and enthused about it, and enough time for them to get involved in the first place. So it can really have a massive sort of impact on whether you get the people that you wanted in the first place. So timing is really, really important. So thinking about your messages, thinking about what are you trying to achieve, what are your goals, and getting people enthused in enough time and space for them to block time in their diaries for them to come along is quite important. Yeah, messages, materials, and meaning. So again, I just mentioned this earlier, but participatory budgeting is quite a jargonistic term. A lot of these terms are. So how can you make that meaningful for people in your local area or your community? So coming up with a message that is a bit more meaningful. What are you actually trying to tell people? Make sure you're prioritizing, like the upside down pyramid. Make sure you prioritize information by giving out the most important piece of information first. So it could literally just be a couple of sentences or a slogan. The secondary information would be how can you participate, how can you get involved, and when can you do this? So how, when, why, maybe. So it can be a good idea to create materials in formats that can be used offline, so in posters or in paper, and then online as well. So just keeping it similar across all. But these are just a few sort of examples. I'm going to get Paul to explain the one in French because I might not be able to translate it well, but there's a few examples here. So we've got the local climate engagement at the top. The reason why that is maybe a good example is because it's got pictures of people. So that, okay, I understand it's, people coming together to discuss something. Fife, I don't think we've got anyone from Fife here, but they've got a sort of ongoing participatory budgeting, and they've called it Let's Talk About Our Fife. So it's, we're talking about our local area. The one at the top, again, is another sort of PB, but on a smaller scale. So Leith is a community in the city of Edinburgh, so in Scotland, and they've called it Leith Chooses. So we're choosing local money for local projects. So it's quite self-explanatory. And then we've got Dundee. So I've picked Scottish examples just because that's where I'm from and it's easy to find. But Dundee decides, again, it's Dundee are deciding something, the city of Dundee. And the picture at the bottom there is actually because Dundee's got quite a big artistic comic creation. They've got quite a big scene with comic creators. So they've got someone to actually design it, which makes sense for their local area. Paul, I'm going to get you to translate the French one actually, because this one's quite, it's got a bit of dark humour in it. But yeah, I'll get you to translate.
So it's linked to the PB and the city of Paris, and it's basically saying, give us our money back. So it's a bit of a direct one and blunt as well. We're not very used to it actually in France, but it worked pretty well apparently, because it's actually relating to what people expect from sometimes what people would expect in France from politics, basically less taxes and more money back. Yep.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, it's not, obviously you might have your local authority brand in itself, but it's almost connecting to that and creating it, making it a little bit more meaningful for the people that live there. And it's about conversations and things. So just thinking about ideas and how you can make that a little bit more relatable to people can be quite important for this. Oh yeah, so the fourth one, again, I think we're going to be coming to this later this afternoon. So Alex will be talking a little bit more about digital engagement. But again, offline and online communication is quite important. Even today, you know, we're in a pandemic, a lot of us are online, but actually we still go to the shops, we still go to the supermarket, we might still pick up flyers and leaflets. So things like notice boards, local newspapers, newsletters, flyers, posters, things like that can be actually quite useful, especially depending on the target audience that you're trying to reach. But yeah, networks of people and established community groups where you can actually just go and talk to people in person as well. They're more likely to be a little bit more engaged if you actually just have a face-to-face conversation with them. So yeah, again, thinking about where people are already talking, where they already meeting can be really useful when you're drafting up a communications plan and strategy. And what groups already exist in your area that you can actually just ask them to maybe join in what you're trying to do. So things like tenants and residents associations. Are there community groups online? So on social media, I think on Facebook, there's, you know, local community groups that you can actually target as well. And searching for those can be quite helpful. Yeah, the last one. So this is just about broadcasting and dissemination and just making it as creative as possible, really. So some last tips, I suppose, is just visual media is usually what attracts people. So if you have a photo call of the people that are involved in your project, faces are more attractive than just written paper, if that makes sense. Of course, get permission to share photos if there's already photos that exist, and try where possible to really illustrate what you're trying to do as creatively as possible. So could it be through video or photos or coverage of events or something quite unique? Just thinking a little bit, how am I going to catch people's attention? No one's going to turn up unless it's interesting, visually interesting, and it has meaning to them. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. And I suppose the last thing is, I mentioned face-to-face and talking to people in person. We tend to email people out a lot, but actually phoning someone and having a chat with them, they're psychologically more likely to be interested if you have a phone call with them. So that's just a last wee tip there on that. I'm not going to go into this because we'll share the slides with you, but it's just some checklist things that if you're developing a communications plan, what you might need to include in that as well. And I'm just going to go into this, which is the last point really, but network mapping versus stakeholder mapping. So I don't know if anyone's heard of this actually, and possibly you already do it. So has anyone heard of network or stakeholder mapping before? You could say no, that's fine. Well, I know you have, Alex. But brilliant. Well, that's okay. It's absolutely fine. Hopefully this might be quite helpful then. So if you're doing a straightforward communications process, network mapping can be quite a laborious, time-consuming task. But the sort of underlining method behind it can be quite useful for any communications plan or execution that you're doing. So the principle behind it is the useful part, essentially. And network mapping is a way to analyse how a group of people are connected to each other. So you can see in that first image, it's got some cartoon people there, and it's got lines in between. So it's how they're connected to each other. So if you imagine that the people that you work with, your friends, the people that you meet during your day, in the shops, who you speak to on a regular basis, how the communications might interlink with all these people. So it's I know them and they know me, and that person knows that person and that person knows that person. So it's imagine you hitch a balloon above the earth and you look down, and you can see all the connections between all these people. And of course, it's highly complicated. There's a mess of connections. And so these little lines in between the people are often called nodes. So it's nodes in between people. Yeah, but you can simplify it. You don't need to do that. You can choose a discrete population. So for example, your target audience or target audiences. So there might be multiple groups of people that you're trying to connect. And you can imagine how these people all connect with each other. How you tend to do this is you might sample a group of people and interview them and figure out how they're connected to each other, and then drawing up a map like this. But of course, you can do this online as well. There's lots of tools that can help you actually map out a network of people. But you're unlikely going to want to spend all your time interviewing people for a really accurate network map, especially, you know, these projects, you've only got 4 months to do it. You really want to get some easy wins. But it still helps to think, how do these people know each other? How might that work? So maybe even writing down a list of organizations and super connected people. So they're called sort of influencers or sneezers because they're connected to wider groups of people. So people that are the right people to give a message to, because they'll pass that message out to their networks. So that can be quite useful to know. Stakeholder mapping is the one that I think is a little bit more useful for you. So you've got the idea and the principles behind network mapping, but stakeholder mapping is so prior to doing your you know, you've got your communications plan. A simplest way of doing this is actually just brainstorming a list of people that you are wanting to connect to. So I don't know if you've got different age groups or different group, you know, in health and social care, or you want to reach young people and children, and you write a super long list. And then you can spend some time sorting through it. So there's a wee template there on the left hand side. So it's keep satisfied, manage closely, monitor, keep informed, and whether they've got high interest or low interest, and whether they've got low influence or high influence. So if they've got high influence and high interest, you're really going to want to connect with that person because they'll have influence on the project, they'll have influence on the decision potentially, and they'll be able to pass the message out for you. So I've just added a sort of template there, and we can share this with you after, but it just helps you to almost write a list of people that your target audience is trying to reach, all the people that have a stake in your project. So thinking about individual people, not just organisations, but it can be both. And then thinking about what is important to that person or that stakeholder. How could they hinder the project, but how could they also get involved or contribute to the project?